Hello, my name is Justin Brown. I'm Vice President of Legislative Affairs at the AALU, and thank you for this special update webinar sponsored by MetLife. This webinar is a follow-up to our estate tax client article that we sent out on November 22nd. It's entitled "Estate Tax Reform in Your Clients." And today I'm honored to have two very esteemed speakers joining me. I have Mark Teitelbaum, Vice President of Advanced Markets at AXA Equitable. Mark, of course, is our current chair of the Wealth Transfer Committee here at the AALU. And then joining him and me is David Wexler, partner and wealth transfer specialist at Greenberg, Wexler and IG. And David is actually the past chair of the Wealth Transfer Committee here at the AALU. And so I appreciate both for joining me today, and hopefully we'll have a good conversation that's of utility to everyone on the phone. Let me just start out with some context and housekeeping. First, the housekeeping. As a follow-up, we obviously encourage questions, and there is a venue for you to do so in the webinar. So please feel free to submit questions. We may not get to all of the questions in the prescribed time that we have today, but what we are doing is a follow-up podcast that will address any questions we don't get to, whether they be submitted today or if someone wants to submit a question later on this afternoon or tomorrow. So be on the lookout for that podcast as well. Now, just jump into the context piece before we get to Mark and David. This whole state tax situation reminds me of something Mark Twain said about his death, which was the reports of his death was greatly exaggerated. And I think a lot can be said also for the estate tax. Obviously, the conventional wisdom is that we're heading to repeal, and it makes sense as to why people would feel that way with a president-elect that supports repeal, as well as a Congress that is on record for supporting repeal too. That said, there's a lot of barriers to getting there legislatively, politically, and so forth. Some of those barriers we pointed out in the article that we sent to the membership on November 22nd. And I really encourage everyone participating in the webinar to refer to that. And then, other barriers are another aspect of this too is that there's a terrific chance that this could snap back, or even worse than snap back, if they do achieve repeal, that you could see rates that are far more draconian and exemption levels far less generous than today's rates and exemption levels. If the Democrats ever regain control here in Washington, given where they are on this policy issue. So there's lots of reasons for clients and prospects not to squander today's insurability on the prospect of tomorrow's legislative deal. And we want to encourage you to deliver that message to your clients and prospects, and we also want to help you to do so. So with that all said, let me get right into it. And Mark, maybe we can start with you if you don't mind. And we're going to get into the details a little further on, but what are you guys currently seeing and hearing in the marketplace? And again, Mark, if you want to take the first shot at that.
I'm not seeing, I will tell you that I'm getting questions. I'm not seeing the panic that I saw perhaps back in 2001. But that said, right after the election, we had two, what I'd call estate tax or liquidity type cases that froze. And one client even told his financial professional, Trump is going to repeal estate taxes. I don't need to do anything. Now, in both instances, the financial advisors and one of the client's CPAs pressed them to do the planning, and both of those cases closed near the end of November. But, you will run into clients that will take a sort of wait and see attitude. And one of the things that we talked about in the pre-call for this webinar was that clients need good advice, and they just need to take the advice to do their planning for how their situation is at the moment. I think most of the AALU members, or many of the AALU members, are seasoned professionals. They've seen this before, and we can't predict how things will shape up in 2017. The world, the Fed budget are different today, and seasoned producers know their plan for a client's needs as they stand at the moment, but keep things as flexible as possible. AALU puts out some great materials. Most producers are affiliated with a carrier, or if they're a broker, they're affiliated with a couple of carriers, and the carriers also have material, but AALU has some good, what I call neutral third-party material that they can arm themselves with. So again, I'll advise producers to stay calm, don't panic, and in fact, I'm not sure that producers necessarily are. I will add that after the election, I probably fielded more calls on whether the Trump administration was going to repeal the DOL regs than about estate taxes, which is a whole separate conversation. Yeah.
Right. So a lot of the advice centers on, ensure that your clients are planning for, essentially they're looking at the situation at the moment, and that they're not making speculative decisions, especially when it concerns their insurability and the cost of insurance for them at the present time.
Right, and as we go through the session, we'll talk about some of the flexibility they could build in.
Great, David, what's your perspective on the marketplace?
Well, it's very much in line with what Mark said, and the thing that we have to remember, and the lesson learned from the last time we went around with this in 2001, is the enemy is not the change. The enemy is the uncertainty, because the uncertainty is the enemy of inertia. So the biggest problem we're going to face in this is people wanting to wait and see about what's going to happen with the tax law before making a decision. So my experience in the marketplace is sort of all over the place, and it's a little similar to what Mark alluded to. I mean, I've had clients who were in the middle of doing a transaction for liquidity planning who have, for reasons other than the tax law, decided that this is a good asset and have pursued this. I've had other advisors, attorney and accountants, come to me and say, well, is there a way for us to preserve the insurability by paying a lesser premium now and then waiting and seeing what happens? And I've heard stories about people who have just decided to go ahead with the transaction because it's good planning anyway, or I need to put a halt on this because I really want to wait and see what happens. So our experience has been all over the place with this. But as advisors, I think we have to look at our experience and come to our clients and say, yes, there is a possibility that estate taxes could be repealed, but that's not the only reason why we need to engage in this planning. And there are lots of other reasons why this is a good asset and needs to be part of your overall plan, whether or not there's an estate tax. So, and we'll talk about some of that as we go into this, but I think we have to draw upon our experience in the past of knowing that, as administrations change, tax laws change, and there can be, everybody that I know has, as a result of this, made adjustments and actually persevered and done well as a result of that. So it's, with change comes opportunity.
Great, David. And so if you had a client today who said, well, David, I want to wait and see here. You've got Trump coming in, and you have the Republican Congress, and the House has already passed repeal, and the Senate passed repeal as part of a budget resolution. I'm betting that there won't be any liability, and I want to wait and see how this all plays out. How you approach that, David, and Mark too. I mean, for your thoughts as well. Do you start to
Every client is different and every circumstance is different.
Right.
So, we always start from the perspective of what problem are we trying to solve and what role is insurance going to play as part of this. So I can give you, and I like to draw upon my experience with things about what's happened to me in the course of practice that I can share with people that might help them to think differently about what they're thinking about. So for example, last year I had a client who was 52 years old, and he was getting involved in a very complicated liquidity transaction. This was a real estate family, and we started doing the planning in April, and by October we had gotten consent to go ahead with the sale of a building to a defective trust, creating the defective trust, starting the insurance exam, and this happened on a Thursday, and on Monday morning I get a call from his brother saying the client had dropped dead on Sunday.
Okay.
And 52 years old. And so there's nothing like an experience like that to sort of create the urgency and the knowledge that, had the insurance been in place, that this would have been a completely different period. And the reason we do this is because of the uncertainty of what can possibly happen, and that there is a true risk of things changing and then not being able to do this when the world changes again. So we have to be mindful of this, that things really do happen, and the value and the importance of what we do is helping people to understand the value of this, not only from a death benefit standpoint, but also in terms of this as an asset class as part of the wealth management of their lives. And this can play an important role, if not only for liquidity, but also for investment reasons. So we need to bear in mind that there are other non-liquidity reasons for having life insurance as part of their asset class, and remind people that things do happen and we've lived through it.
Right. And what David's saying is, is generally where we've seen the market move. Back in 2001, things were very different. There was $1 million exemption. Estate tax repeal affected a enormous may be the wrong word, but a major piece.
The base was much broader.
The base was broader, exactly. And over that decade, several things. First, and to David's point, people did tend to put out their planning, but again, plan for the client as things exist today, because in 2000, clients died in 2005, clients died in 2007. They didn't wait till estate taxes were repealed in 2010. But during that decade is the first, life insurance as an asset has been around for a while, but I first started to work with a producer from Chicago about 2003, 2004 on the concept, and over the years we've seen it really popularize. To David's point, life insurance is a phenomenal asset, and so even if the clients don't end up using it for liquidity, it becomes a very effective piece of the overall wealth transfer picture, and it offers that stabilization element that other client assets may not be able to provide.
Right.
And by minimum paying, you also can have a tremendous IRR play.
Right.
Or other policy decides. Yeah.
Right. And, for those of us that lived through 1987 and 2008 and 2009, we know that the market has tremendous volatility. And so here is a way of creating an asset class that doesn't have that same sort of volatility. And there is a shift from investment volatility and economic risk to the certainty of mortality risk. And that can be a very compelling story when you're trying to plan finances with assets, particularly that are not easy to dispose of. So don't lose sight of the notion that life insurance for the high net worth can be a very important asset class as they think about how they're going to devise distribution strategies for their children, grandchildren, and more remote descendants.
Right. That's a great point too, to David. one of the things that occurs to me is obviously tax reform is a major priority for the tax writers in Congress. We have the House Republican blueprint for tax reform did repeal the state tax. So the thought is that if you did have major tax reform, that there may be a state tax repeal as part of that. Certainly in the House version of it, whatever the Senate does is less clear. And of course, we should all remember that tax reform, as with a lot of major pieces of legislation, is all about an exercise of what the Senate will let the House do, given how things work in the Senate. But anyway, given some of these, you've got huge hurdles with tax reform. I mean, even with all and obviously the Speaker and Chairman Brady are devoted to the issue. There are still a lot of friction there, and you've got winners and losers. You've got the lack of tax reform as a grassroots policy priority. It's not like the voters, the blue-collar voters in Wisconsin that put Trump over the top did so because of what he was saying, tax reform. You've got the gap between businesses that file as S corps, which tend to be smaller, and those who file as C corps. And then, obviously you've got the policy and the political and the procedural limitations associated with reconciliation, which is probably what the Republicans are looking at if they want to pass tax reform, because that will allow them to pass it in the Senate with simple majority instead of the 60 supermajority. So with all that said, and I think we covered some of this already, but I really do want to stress it, with all this uncertainty, and it seems like, this is a situation where people ought to be turning it to insurance, not running away from it. What do you really, sort of bottom line telling your clients, David? And then Mark, what are you hearing from your perspective at AXA along the same lines? Just, is it going back to selling the intrinsic value of life insurance? Is it, don't think that liquidity need's going to disappear because this thing could come back? What's sort of the bottom line there?
Yeah, David, go ahead.
Okay. Well, look, first of all, the most important thing about insurance is your ability to be able to acquire it. And we all live in a world where things change, despite the fact that we think that we're always going to be healthy and buying the next policy is going to not be a problem. And so, I mean, if you're even considering the possibility of getting insurance, protecting your insurability is very important because things can change in an instant. The other thing is, I got into this business in the 70s, and the first thing I remember was that my heroes at the time were all people who were in the pension business, and they were selling a lot of life insurance in defined benefit pension plans. And it was sort of the perfect storm. It was tax deductible premiums, tax-free death benefits, and estate tax-free death benefits. I mean, how easy could that be? And then in 1981, that all changed because of reduction in something known as the actuarial equivalent rules, and people stopped doing life insurance in defined benefit plans. Now, did all those people give up? They said no. They found another avenue for solving problems with life insurance, and other opportunities emerged due to other changes in the tax law. And then the lesson learned from 2001 to 2009 is that, while repeal might be heavy on the Republican agenda and the blueprint for America, that the likelihood of it being permanently repealed is difficult at best. So it sort of plays into the, well, let's wait and see attitude, but it also plays into the notion that, if we wait too long, the opportunity may no longer be there. So there's always a sense of urgency about if this makes sense from an asset class standpoint, it's going to make even that much more sense from a liquidity standpoint if either A, it doesn't go away the way we think it's going to go, or B, if there is an estate tax, it only comes in the form of a capital gains tax as opposed to an actual estate tax. So again, it's a valuable tool to have in the toolbox either from an asset class standpoint or a liquidity tool standpoint. But the uncertainty is going to want to make people postpone. But the reality is, having lived through this in several iterations, we know that it is just as likely to change again when the administration changes. So you can't necessarily count on permanent repeal. As a matter of fact, in 2012, that was supposed to be the permanent solution. And you had the biggest estate tax hawk on the planet in the form of John Kyle, who agreed to this as a solution because it exempted 99% of the population from estate taxes. So, I'm not worried about the notion, is because I know it's just as likely to change in 5 years as it changes today.
Yeah, and I think David. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Justin. No, I was going to say David's lesson about his client who passed just before the planning was executed is a lesson well taken. I mean, I think we've all seen stories like that. Lock in your insurability, and again, to David's point, clients will tend to defer because of the uncertainty. But the advice that we've typically given is very much along the lines of what we've been talking about. In 2016, we're sitting in a world where we had 100 years of estate taxes in some form or another, and the history of estate taxes goes back far further than that. So things will shift, particularly in the budget world we're in today. As much as estate taxes have been marginalized, it still is a significant source of revenue. And so for that, we do recommend clients do lock in their insurability. Having insurance in an irrevocable trust, it's always a good idea. I mean, again, if not for liquidity, for wealth transfer and the IRR play. You can always use it to provide for the family. You can always use it to provide for wealth stabilization, but build in the flexibility for a trustee to swap out assets of equal value, build in that grantor trust status, and frankly, take advantage of today's ultra low interest rates. CLATs for the charitably inclined, private financing for those who have some liquid net worth or the ability to margin assets. That remains the advice we're giving, but so much more, I will add that so much of what we've been talking about in the last few years has been less estate liquidity and more true wealth transfer, legacy planning. I'm not sure that as things shake out in 2017 and the balance of this decade, that we'll see sales necessarily marginalized. I think there will continue to be a life insurance need.
I'm going to quickly segue to a couple of questions that have been submitted online, and appreciate those who have submitted questions. But before I do, one of the things I did want to mention, and this is for what it's worth, but part of my day job here at the AALU is to talk to Republican taxpayers in particular on the estate tax, and I can tell you that a number of them, while publicly would not admit to this, essentially say the same thing, which is I think we've solved this problem. They see the lives affected tables, they see the data on revenue, they see members of the coalition that used to be a part of the state tax repeal coalition drop out of that coalition. A prime example of that is the American Dental Association, who used to lobby on this issue and no longer do so because at today's exemptions it just doesn't impact their members. And so the dynamics on this issue have changed a lot, the political and policy dynamics, and that's something too that I think is always important to remind clients who may be purchasing for liquidity purposes and no other purpose. Let me get to the questions very quickly. One's a statement, and this is a good point, is that there's always a ripple effect to policy. You throw the rock in the pond, and the ripple sort of thing, and who knows how states will act if there is federal, if there's an estate tax grab on this federally. In fact, what's interesting in New Jersey, the Democratic candidate for governor there is already campaigning on changing their repeal legislation in the state. So, that just also kind of, adds some weight to the whole snapback type argument that you could make with clients. And that's something we're going to do a little bit of research here at AALU and maybe push out to the membership just to illustrate an example that, hey, as the founding fathers called the state's the laboratory for democracy, maybe it's a preview of what will happen if they do repeal the estate tax. You've got estate tax repeal recently enacted in New Jersey, and now the Democratic candidate for governor there, who stands a good chance of being elected, is saying we need to reinstate the estate tax. So there's that. On I've a couple of questions on process points here in Congress. One is, what is the vote needed to repeal? Is it a 60% vote, which is a 60 vote, which is the threshold to file cloture, which allows the Senate or disallows senators from filibustering, or is it a simple majority? Well, it depends on the situation. So if Congress were to consider a state tax repeal as a standalone bill, with a bill number on its own, and it's HR 55, and it passes the House and then goes to the Senate. In that case, they would have to file cloture, which means they would need 60 votes, according to current Senate rules. Now, they could change the Senate rules. In fact, many in the House want them to do so, but Senate leadership is not willing to do that. In fact, I think Democrats are kind of feeling the pain a little bit on nominations, where they changed the 60 vote rule for nominations with the so-called nuclear option, which the Republicans may continue with only nominations. So if it's a standalone piece of legislation with its own bill number, it's going to need 60 votes in the Senate. Now, as far as it being included in tax reform, that's when things get a little bit more interesting. If they were to do tax reform through this process called reconciliation, there is, which is, a lot of folks, a lot of the pundit class right now feel that that's the only way to get tax reform done, because there's just not, the gap between Democrats and Republicans on this issue is too extreme. Then they can do it with a 51 vote margin, simple majority. The drawback with that, however, is that there are certain budget requirements that this legislation would have to meet. For instance, it would have to score as a revenue raiser in the out years. That is, like, say the budget window is 10 years, year 11 and beyond, for it to quote unquote be permanent. In the case of tax reform, that is not likely. So what you would see is something similar to what you had with the Bush tax cuts. And again, the devil's in the details, but you would see, let's say they did a 10-year budget window for reconciliation. They had a state tax repeal in the tax reform package. You would have repeal, but in year 11, you would go back to current law, which is, today's exemption and today's rate. So that's a snapback. And so obviously that's, when you're trying to do comprehensive tax reform, never mind a state tax repeal, that's a problematic approach that Republicans will have to make decisions on as they move forward with the year. And that's, it gets to the third question we've received, which is permanent versus non-permanent. To the extent tax law is permanent would be what I described if they were able to pass tax reform with repeal, not using reconciliation, or if they were able to pass repeal as a standalone, which would have to meet that 60 vote threshold, then it would be quote unquote permanent. There would be no sunsetting, no sunset date. In the other scenarios I outlined, it would not be considered permanent because it would have a sunset date, the length of the budget window that they choose. Could be 5 years, could be 10 years. Probably not much longer than that. So that's that's a couple of questions right now. And actually, I do have one question more for David and Mark. Let me just read it out to you. Preserving insurability sounds like a term sale unless you can convince the client that the insurance makes sense as an asset class. In parens, a difficult sale, I think. Do you agree? So, Mark and David, like to get your reaction to that.
Well, Mark,
ahead,
you want to
David.
start? No,
Well,
you go ahead.
No, I'll say, yeah, sometimes it can be a difficult sale. I mean, we certainly saw a lot of sales after the market crash in 2008 become term sales that did convert to permanent sales in that 2011, 2012, 2013 period. After the shock of the news. So the term sale is a valid approach. That said, any good carrier has a range of products that offers some ability to manipulate the design. And my actuarial coworkers probably won't want me to hear me say this, but it is possible to, particularly with flexible insurance products, to play around with either minimizing the premium, locking in the insurance, playing with the premium stream, and even adding certain riders that aren't necessarily available with a term conversion, where you can really ratchet up the IRR on a case. And that is, I mean, a producer probably should give clients a range of options, term being one of them, but recognizing that when they convert, they'll convert at a higher, at their current age, versus some of the flexible premium options with riders that a client might also want to entertain. David?
Well, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, there are a lot of different sort of products that you have access to. You can talk about term, universal life, indexed, whole life, variable life, and private placement. So, depending upon what your client's sort of tolerance is for the underlying risk of the assets that support the death benefit, there's a lot of flexibility, but it also means you have to go a little deeper with the client and try to help them flesh out what their objectives are and why insurance might play a role to this. So going to the issue of, is this a term sale or is it a permanent sale? It might be that it's just a term insurance sale to inventory to protect insurability, and that might be the best solution for someone that wants to wait and see. But on the other hand, you can get a lot of times a long-term better result by using a creatively designed universal life contract where you can start with a minimum premium and then if things change, accelerate that premium and create the high IRR on death benefit by using the flexibility inherent in the contract. So it's not necessarily a question of, yes, I might create more term insurance sales, but how creative can you be using a flexible contract that will help to solve the problem? The other thing is we're getting a lot more traction from people that are in the investment advisory business about using life insurance as a tool to help manage volatility. Sure, if you're using a linear assumption as to the rate of return that you're going to get on a portfolio, you might get a much higher yield on a portfolio if you're looking 30 or 40 years out. But there's nothing like a life insurance policy in terms of the effect that it will have on a portfolio, particularly if it's trust-owned, if mortality occurs prior to life expectancy. So people are starting to look at this from a little different standpoint of, yes, I might be willing to give up a little bit of return on the back end in exchange for potentially creating a much more valuable asset prior to life expectancy, particularly for something that, if it's trust owned, is going to get a step up in basis. So I think the tax sale, if you go through and look at asset classes, is not necessarily as difficult as you might think.
Yeah, David, I think your key phrase, there's a couple of things that you said that were real central, but I think the long-term flexibility in terms of what you have with a permanent policy versus term is key. But yes, exactly to your point, that we still see a lot of wealth transfer sales. Those wealth transfer sales, whether for stability, whether it's for the IRR, again, that so-called life insurance as an asset class sale, those really demand permanent insurance. Term really won't necessarily fit the bill here.
Right, and particularly if you're working with older clients, people who
Correct.
are in their 60s and 70s, where the IRR at life expectancy can be very, very attractive, and there are limiting factors on conversion because a lot of it is age-related, and at 70, it could easily go away and expire.
Correct. Yeah, and there you really need the permanent coverage.
Right.
So, but to your point, to the earliest discussions, it depends on what the client most needs. And if it is liquidity and they just want to defer the decision, perhaps you do lock in the insurability with term, but I don't think it's a long-term solution.
So let's, we've got, we're running out of time, but I did want to get to a couple of other points. And then before I get to my final question for you and Mark and David, number one, I just want to tell the audience out there that, this is just the beginning of our communications to the field on this issue. And we're doing an exercise similar with this for other marketplaces that may be impacted by tax reform more generally. Obviously we've written a couple of pieces of trying to give some guidance, third-party guidance on what to say to clients. We have a follow-up webinar and podcast. But in the weeks ahead and into the months ahead, we'll be leveraging the experience of not only some of the top producers in the field that we represent, but also our counsel at Greenberg Tarek, to provide their insights and what they're gleaning from the marketplace. And these insights are really unique to AALU. The bottom line is we're going to be a partner with the field force on this issue throughout its lifespan, if you will, in helping you to interface with your clients, as well as the other part of this, which we haven't discussed on today's call, only because of the focus of today's call was slightly different, which is advocacy on this issue. We have repeatedly been a strong advocate for permanent and sustained estate tax. A lot of the technical provisions that were agreed to in the fiscal cliff deal, like portability and increasing the Lincoln coupling the estate tax with the gift tax, were things that AALU fought for, and that has not changed. So currently, just to give a sense, bring people up to speed very quickly, we are working with other interested groups on this issue in developing updated data, updated messaging, scheduling Hill meetings, and with both sides of the aisle to ensure our perspective is heard and hopefully that our perspective wins today. And I think, there is a notion of some people get concerned, well, doesn't it sound self-serving? And we did just receive a question along those lines. And I guess my message is this, is when it comes to your client's insurability and the fact that, as Mark pointed out, we've had an estate tax for 100 years, it's completely reasonable to say to a member of Congress, a Republican member of Congress even, that by repealing the estate tax, you make this more of an issue than it currently is. And if there's ever a change in control down the road, or if you do this through reconciliation and there's a sunsetting of what you do, my clients are going to have that issue, and they may not have the same insurability or the insurability at the same price 10 years down the road. And when you have to plan from one generation to the next, and much less, and actually multiple generations, having permanent and sustainable law is, as much as you can, is real critical. And that's why, you know, we feel like the Republicans, you know, to the message to them is, you know, the fiscal cliff deal is a good deal for your perspective on this issue. And if you revisit it, you're just going to antagonize those on the more progressive side to look at this in a way that would not be advantageous for our clients. So, you know, I think this is a message we have successfully taken up to the Hill, and we will continue to take up to the Hill. But I did want to let the audience know that we are working hard on that advocacy piece on this, and that includes working with groups outside of the industry who share the concern.
You know, just another thing you didn't mention, and which goes to the difficulty of all of this, is if they repeal the estate tax, there's no mention about what will happen with the gift tax, and that I think is actually more problematic.
And then there's still the debate between step up and carryover. You know, of course, the Brady repeal had included step up, but past repeal efforts had a carryover system, which, you know, poses its own set of challenges and you know, which impact a broader set of people than the state tax currently does, and do so at greater amounts, most likely. And then
this is the type of thing that gets hashed out in committee versus some of the rhetoric that's flying around right now. And
correct. So let me let's I think let's just have like a clear, distinct takeaway. We fleshed out a lot, and again, this is just a part of the conversation. To those listening to the webinar, we will be doing these routinely over the next you know, few months, just to keep you updated on the latest and greatest as this issue quickly evolves. Obviously, it's a very fluid situation. But, you know, what are some of the sort of key takeaways in your mind, both Mark and David, you know, in terms of what people should be saying to their clients or prospects?
Mark, you want to start?
Yeah. I mean, first, from a producer standpoint, don't panic. You know, Justin, one of the points in the question about is AALU organizing a fight about this is how much is attributable to true estate liquidity sales. And we've looked at that number, at least here, for one carrier. And it's true estate liquidity sales, and sometimes they're a little difficult to tell because they aren't always recorded correctly on our business systems, but probably low teens. More of the sales that we're seeing are in that wealth transfer range. And with that in mind, I think producers have, again, a range of tools to work with clients on. There will be a liquidity need. We talked about the fact that states are going to be looking for revenue. There may well be a capital gain tax, and while it's difficult to put a fire under a client when you're talking about what might be a 20% tax, maybe 25, 30 when you throw the state tax in there versus a higher Fed tax, you know, work and educate clients about the difficulty of pure 100% estate tax repeal in the larger picture of tax reform, the resilience of the estate tax, the need to plan today based on the client's current needs, and the fact that properly designed insurance is a valuable planning tool, and that don't necessarily only pigeonhole it purely for a liquidity purpose that may or may not happen.
Right.
Sure.
So I want to reiterate what Mark said, which was, A, don't panic. I mean, first of all, when everybody else is experiencing uncertainty, that's going to create anxiety for you, but more importantly, it'll create anxiety for your clients. So in a time when they're probably experiencing that uncertainty, the calmer and more certain that you can be, the better your clients are going to feel. All of that being said, at least in our practice, we try to keep the perspective of liquidity is one of about 10 different things we do for our clients. We help people with matters of personal financial security. We help businesses with business succession. We help with things like key person indemnification. We do executive benefits, and we do wealth transfer strategy as part of an overall wealth management process for our clients. So none of the other things change. People are still going to need financial security that life will preserve. Life insurance will be out there. People will still need business succession. They'll still need insurance as part of some sort of executive benefit or perk package, whether it's COLI, funding non-qualified, or phantom stock plan. So there's a lot of things we can still do for our clients where we can bring value and give good advice. Liquidity is just one of many tools that we have in our clients. So don't lose sight of the fact that there are a lot of other opportunities and a lot of other value that we can bring to our clients.
Another thing I'll just add too is at the high-end client marketplace, we all work through centers of influence. We're not always necessarily working as the client's sole advisor. And this is AALU provides some remarkable resources. This is where you want to really leverage those resources, leverage what you can receive from other avenues, and just really hold yourself out as a resource to some of these other centers of influence, because they're not necessarily operating on the same plane as we are. And you know, there's a lot you can bring to the table.
Yeah, there's one thing I'll just add to that. Was I had a mentor many years ago. His name was Fred Stitt, and he was always fond of saying, "Life insurance is deceptively complicated." And to Mark's point, you know, the people in our community look to us as experts, as subject matter experts. And so, to the extent that you can position yourself as a subject matter expert with other advisors who are not expert in these things, I think there will always bring value to them, and that will result in business for us. So just keep that in mind.
Well, I appreciate everyone's time today. One thing I will add is, you know, to Mark's point, we at the AALU have very specific conversations routinely with Republican and Democratic policymakers on the estate tax issue, and we are happy to give you any sort of inside baseball type information that we are learning in sort of a real-time update, you know, as best as we can. And if you're interested in pursuing that, you know, feel free to reach out to me at brown@aalu.org. And I'm happy to walk through the latest dynamics of the issue with you, and I have colleagues here who will do the same. So I did want to offer that to the crowd. Appreciate MetLife for sponsoring this webinar. Again, we will have a follow-up podcast, and please stay tuned for further webinars and podcasts and written materials on tax issues in general as we begin the 115th Congress next year. Thank you again. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, David.
Sure, it's a
Thank
pleasure.
you, guys.
Thank you.